welcome all on our sixth meeting, the sixth week already of the eighth that we have planned on integrating citizen science with water resources research, and that across the globe. Today, quite technical seminars on apps, mobile phones, and center-based hydrological monitoring. Let's see if this works. We already, last week, we had some really nice discussions on social and ethical dilemmas, and you see we had 5 other weeks. If you want to see them, they are all recorded and can be viewed on YouTube. Today's first speaker is Chris Lowry. He is Associate Professor in the Department of Geology at the University of Buffalo. He works in water supply and groundwater dependent ecosystems and gets really excited about that work. But he's also well known for running a water level observation network called Crowd Hydrology. And we look much forward to your talk, Chris.
Great, thanks, Tom. All right, awesome. So my name is Chris Lowry. I'm at the University of Buffalo, and today I want to talk to you about crowdsourcing stream stage. And I want to propose this idea that in hydrology, we have this kind of gold standard, and this gold standard is real-time, spatially, and temporally distributed observations. And this is kind of what we're always striving for. And there's times when we don't always have the resources to do this. And so I want to propose today to think about how we can use mobile phones as something to hopefully strive for this. And so my talk today is going to go through a couple of components. I'm going to kind of talk to you kind of my origin story of how I got into crowdsourcing hydrologic data. I'm going to talk to you about the methodologies that we use, specifically smartphones and dumb phones. And then I want to talk about a little side idea of kind of ugly babies in crowdsourcing. I'll talk about the mobile phone aspect, and then I'll talk about some observations and some advances that, or some advice that I think maybe I can provide to those who are interested in kind of getting into this. So to start out, as kind of at the beginning of my career, I started at the University of Buffalo in 2010. And I had a real interest in groundwater and surface water interactions. But one of the problems is, as a faculty member, and I think people realize this, is that there's a limited amount of funds that you have. And so as a result, I was looking for ways in order to collect distributed spatially and temporal measurements. And I received actually from a friend of mine, a newspaper article about a system in California that was used to monitor pathways of animals across kind of infrastructure. And what they actually did was they actually asked people to send them, and this is weird, but they asked them to send pictures of roadkill in order to understand how there were corridors across urban environments where animals would move. And I read this article and I thought, you know, this is the strangest thing. But what I realized was that if there are people that are out there that are willing to send in observations of roadkill, there's got to be a way in order to harness the crowd in order to send in observations like water levels. And so I had seen a system from the US Geological Survey where they would recruit people to put a staff gauge in a stream and then send in postcards once a month of water levels. And I thought, if the USGS can do this and someone can someone can collect information on roadkills, how can we not combine these two ideas and get spatially and temporally distributed measurements? And so what I decided to do was I decided to invest $500 in my startup package in order to buy some signs and buy some staff gauges and see if we could make this work. And so this is the system that we came up with. Basically what we decided to do was we decided to put staff gauges in streams, put a simple sign, and the signs that you can see on the right-hand side are actually kind of upgraded signs. The first signs we started with were just laminated pieces of paper that I printed off on my regular printer. And what this system did was this system asked people to send in information on water levels and a station ID. And what we decided to do in order to keep the lowest barrier of entry was we decided to make this a text-based system. So we asked people to send a text message to a specific phone number with the water level. That text message then came into our system, and what we had was we have a Python code. It was actually written by Mike Feenan, my collaborator on this at the US Geological Survey. And that code parses those data and then fills them into a database. And so when we started out, we were actually using Google Voice. In the United States, Google Voice was a free phone service. And now we've switched over to a paid phone service it's called Twilio, which is used by a lot of different companies. And so we set up this network and just put in a few observations, and now this observation network has grown. So in the United States, we're now in about 25 states. We have about 200 stations. And this graph here in the bottom, you can see is what data looks like from our system. This is actually the first station we set up. And you can see that early on, there was very, very precise data. There's a few outliers. Then in about 2016, it kind of gets a little scattered. And this has to do with not only the system changing, but also people who we consider champions, folks that were continuously sending us measurements, actually moving away from the site, and now it's having more of a crowd and less of a kind of a consistent network. And so this system worked really well. But what I want to say, and I think this is important to kind of express to other people, is that these systems don't always work well. And so I want to just promote an idea that was actually defined by Alan Shapiro of ugly babies. The crowd hydrology system that we had that tracked water levels, it worked well, and it worked well right off the bat. I have tried this in a bunch of other settings using mobile phones, and I want to say that it hasn't always worked well. In New York State, we were interested in tracking actually truck movement that were moving water from hydraulically fractured wells. And we tried to set up a similar system like this, that we could do this with kind of a smartphone-based system. And we had a problem of just getting people engaged. I've tried systems where we've used the same kind of idea of, instead of text messages, but actually having people send us videos. And these videos we were trying to use in order to use particle tracking velocimetry in order to get stream flow. And that didn't work so well for us too. And we've tried some small kind of hacker ideas. So I just want to say that although I'm showing you results that look really good, we've worked really hard, and this doesn't always work. And there's sometimes some ugly babies that we maybe don't admit. And so I just want to say, like, our system's not perfect, and there are problems, but I want to just, I guess, acknowledge that. So with that, let me talk to you about smartphones, and let me talk to you about dumb phones, and kind of how we kind of adapted this to our project. Early on, as we were talking, we decided that we would actually have this text-based system, which I mentioned before. And part of this was that back in 2010, I didn't even own a smartphone. And so as a result, I saw kind of the dumb phone as the easiest way to get people engaged. The nice thing about this is that texting is a very natural thing to understand, and it's not an expensive thing to do, right? In the United States, unlike other countries, texting is usually free with your data plan. It's really easy to maintain because basically we're putting the value of telemetry on the citizen scientist, and there's really no training. One of the limitations of this, though, is that we really don't get two-way user engagement. With text messages, as opposed to some kind of smartphone app, what we're doing is we're having someone send us a water level observation, and then in return, we are saying thank you, and we're giving them a link to that observation so they can see the hydrograph. But there's not that kind of user engagement. We don't have this idea where we can kind of gamify things like you could with a smartphone app. There are also some potential timestamp issues as cell phone coverage changes in the United States. And so there are some remote locations where someone will send in a text message, but their phone will not have connection. And as a result, we have a delay that we actually don't know that we have a delay in some of these water level methods. And then there's also some limits on kind of the methodology in terms of using text-based messages. So we can have people send us observations of very simple things. So as of right now, we can have them send us observations of water levels. We can also have them send observations of temperature. And we can also have them send us pictures, but there's kind of limited growth using just a simple text-based kind of system. There are some other options that we've been looking at, and I think it's something that we should think about, but the thinking about the use of QR codes or thinking about the use of NFC tags in order to kind of engage with the public through their cell phones. And I'll admit, even though in 2010 I didn't have a smartphone, now most people do have smartphones. So these ideas of QR codes or NFC tags are actually a good way that I think we can engage with people. The other thing I want to talk about this, and this is not so much of a technical issue, but this is just an issue for people thinking about getting into this, is that growth can kind of be slow. And we talked about, actually in other seminars this series, we've kind of talked about the growth of projects. And there are times early in this project where for the first year and a half, really, I had no growth whatsoever. And it started to grow staggering based on kind of seasonality when people were out and people got excited. The other thing is that sometimes these projects don't always align with professional science metrics. And so I want to talk about early career faculty members and thinking about how these kinds of projects and using smartphones may or may not align with what your colleagues think are important versus kind of what you think is important. And I think that's an interesting idea. And then the final thing, and this came out in maybe the first or second seminar we were talking about in this series, was this idea that projects evolve. And so I will fully admit that this crowd hydrology project, when we started, was a very top-down approach, us trying to extract information at locations that we really cared about. And then later on, this project has shifted actually from more of a bottom-up approach. So now I kind of passively run this system and people come and say, we have this interesting idea, can we put this on your network? And so I think there is kind of an evolution of this. The other thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about sustainability, and I want to talk about kind of the sustainability and timelines that run with these kinds of systems. While using smartphones is cheap in the sense that I'm not really paying for the telemetry, there are time constraints and funding constraints that you kind of need to think about, even with these kind of smartphone things. I've picked a system that is based on texting, and so those are fairly inexpensive. I'm actually showing you my invoices for my Twilio account for the last year. And so you can see that these invoices, I'm not spending a lot. This is, less than $30 US. But at the same time, I also want to talk about, in order to have a sustainable program, you also need to have funding, and that funding is sometimes incongruent with what's going on. And so on the top right corner, what I want to say is that here are all the folks that have funded us through the years, and you'll see that those are very sporadic. And it's a very interesting mix of kind of people who keep this kind of thing alive. The other thing that I want to say is that anytime you're engaging with the public, there's a lot of time of just shaking hands and talking to people over the phone. And so sometimes as a professional scientist, we don't always think about this. But when you're engaging people, people want engagement. They want to talk to you. And so this is something that I want to stress as a piece of advice for people thinking about using mobile phones on these kinds of things. You will get called. You will have to answer questions. And actually, that's some of the joy. And those are some of the friendships that you make in these kind of things. And then the final thing is that there's always data storage needs. So our smartphone or our dumb phone data is coming into the system, and we need to think about where we can store that and where we can access that. And I think that that's getting a lot easier. Early on, our system simply just put these data into a comma-separated variables Excel spreadsheet, basically. And now we're using some things that are a little more, I guess, professional.
2 minutes.
So finally, I want to say a little bit about the future and the future of using smartphones. And we're going to actually talk about this in a seminar in 2 more weeks, I think. And that's the idea of integrating data. So a lot of times we just collect this data and we hold on to it. What I want to say is that I really think the future is taking these kinds of data and driving numerical models and using these models in a spatially and temporally distributed way. And so this is a project that if you're interested in, there's a QR code on the right-hand side that you can kind of look at this and see how we have done some data assimilation with citizen science data in order to drive models to predict stream flow, stream temperature, and actually in the end, quality of fish habitat. So with that, I want to make the final kind of blanket conclusion. I'm not sure that crowdsourcing hydrologic data with smartphones is the gold standard. I don't think it is. But what I hope is, I hope that as our community grows and our community builds, that we are a standard, that government agencies will start to use our crowdsourced data in interesting ways. And mobile phones is a really important part of that. And so with that, here's the funding that has supported us. And at the bottom here are all the institutions that we've partnered with in order to kind of make this happen. And then finally, here is a collection of papers that might be interesting to you on these ideas. There are papers that look at how we deal with the messaging. There's papers that just talk about kind of growing pains, and there's papers that talk about data assimilation. So with that, I'll leave it and I'll answer any questions, I guess when we're at the end.
Thanks so much, Chris, for this beautiful overview and impressive long duration that you have maintained the network already. Really impressive. Indeed, we will take some questions after the second speaker. I also want to say that some of the QR codes, etc., that you shared, we will put on the CUAHSI website for the citizen science information, so that people can later on make a photo, a screen dump of your QR codes. So we will do that. With that, thanks a lot, Chris. Then we go to our next speaker, which is Professor Wouter Buitaert. Wouter is professor in hydrology and water resources at Imperial College London. He works on the interface of hydrological process understanding, water resource management, and sustainable development. He has a keen interest in participatory science, knowledge co-creation, and science and interaction with society. He is also the proud and very deserved recipient of the Darcy Medal in EDU 2022, and we are very happy to have you here, Wouter, and I look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Tom, for a great, very kind introduction, and thank you for everyone for joining in. I'll try and share my screen. So hopefully you should see that now. So indeed, in the next 13 minutes, be very keen to take you to a very different part of the world and a very different approach to citizen science, or more broadly, community-based hydrological science. And just to add a bit to the context of the way the work we do. So my research group, I'm an academic based at Imperial College, and our research group really focuses on solving what we call, or try to find local solutions to global water security, understanding the hydrology as the terrestrial water cycle and the processes that govern that, but then take that knowledge to tackle specific and local grand challenges related to water resources, water risk management, and how that links to the livelihoods of local people in various parts of the world. We work a lot in developing regions in the global south, particularly in mountain regions like the Andes and the Himalayas, where we look at aspects like, for instance, the impact of glacier melt and climate change on water resources, water-related risks, and what kind of catchment interventions can be designed to alleviate some of those issues, to compensate some of the negative impacts of environmental change. Traditional approaches, including hard infrastructure, but increasingly also nature-based solutions and novel approaches to enhancing water availability and water security, such as water sowing and harvesting strategies. And obviously, in doing that, one of the big issues is the global data scarcity, which is a global phenomenon, but is obviously very pronounced in the kind of complex and data scarce regions like mountain environments, which are extremely heterogeneous, extremely diverse, and at the same time count with a very low amount of available data. So for instance, starting in the Andes, which is a place we've worked in for the last 20 years, we teamed up with local counterparts, NGOs and local academics, to set up some what we call a participatory monitoring network to to address that issue of a lack of data, particularly in the high mountain environments, which is where we do most of our work. And so back in 2009, together with a local NGO called Convened, we co-founded what we call the Participatory Network for Hydrological Monitoring of Andean Ecosystems, which for its Spanish, in Spanish has the acronym iMHEA. And it started off as a relatively small-scale initiative in Ecuador and Peru, but has since then grown into a large network in more than 22 sites scattered along the Andes, as you can see in the map on the right-hand side, monitoring mostly river flow and rainfall in small upland catchments with the idea of assessing the impact of different types of land management, often in a pairwise catchment comparison approach, comparing a natural with an intervened catchment and using that to trade space for time, if you will, and analyze the impact of different types of land use change. Initially, mostly negative impacts of things like deforestation, livestock grazing, and cultivation, but increasingly also positive changes, impacts of, for instance, local water sowing and harvesting practices. And that has worked really well, has generated a wealth of information, really allowed us to increase and create a solid evidence base of different land use impacts. And I won't go into too much detail on this slide. If you'd like to dig into the data, then I can refer you to some of the papers that are referenced here in the slides. But just to highlight the way that we managed to really pull together expertise and create, if you will, a community of practice using similar approaches, using comparable data to identify regional patterns of land use impact and hydrological responses. But what I would like to draw upon or focus on here is the way that we used technologies. We started with off-the-shelf commercially available sensors of the type that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which worked well in the sense that they generated good quality data, but also had some issues. The main issue being cost. iMHEA is very much a grassroots initiative, so obviously cost and resources are very limited, and cost is always an issue, especially in many of those countries where technologies and sensors need to be imported and where the cost kind of doubles when they are imported and passed through customs. So that was one issue, but also issues with robustness. We're talking about quite extreme environments here, up 4,000 to 5,000 meters high. So issues with temperature compensation, air pressure, and all that often cause us headaches in terms of post-processing the data. But also simple things like software licenses. A lot of those sensors come with proprietary software, which is not always available in the local language, requires a license which might not be compatible with local computer systems. The same for manuals, data formats, and all. And so altogether, that really wasn't an ideal solution. So what do? Well, we said we can do better, and basically leveraged the wealth of open source hardware available in the Arduino community to build our own low-cost logging platform. We still use commercially available and off-the-shelf sensors. You can see a very popular non-contact ultrasound sensor that we use for water level. Later on, we've also expanded it to some other types of sensors, particularly LiDAR, as a very promising non-contact sensor for water level as well, which allows us to measure larger ranges than what ultrasound can do, and especially in places like the Himalayas, where we had some projects on community-based flood early warning, as you can see here on the left-hand side, requires sensors with a larger range than what ultrasound could provide. But basically, what we focused on was build an open source hardware platform for logging that allowed us to, first of all, bring down the cost, but also get us more control about things like data formats, including telemetry and teaching and building capacity locally to manage that platform and maintain it in a way that's much more robust and cost effective than what commercially available solutions allow us. And for those interested in the technical details, here are some of the technical details. We stick quite closely to the Arduino bootloaders using the iMHEA 328 processor, a kind of true and tested processor within the Arduino community. We combined it with certain functionality, SD cards for places where we don't have mobile phone coverage, and a cellular modem for the places where we do have it, solar charging, internal storage, so we don't have to switch on the modem too regularly, and can have some buffer in case the network falls out. We use the ThingSport data platform, also an open source and very popular data platform for receiving the data, which you can set up and get it up and running quite easily. So nothing too novel, just using a lot of available components, bringing them together into a small, cost-effective and robust solution that allowed us to bring down the cost and increase the reliability in the context of the participatory monitoring activities that we implemented. But obviously, this is a series about citizen science. So zooming a bit into the lessons or the implications for citizen science, we consider iMHEA to be a citizen science project, but probably of a quite different nature of most of the citizen science projects that we've seen passing through this seminar series, in the sense that it has obviously far less focus on the data collection, or at least citizens being involved in data collection. It is not a crowdsourcing type of project, given that obviously if you do have automatic sensors, there's less need to be heavily involved and spend a lot of time in on the data collection. And indeed, one of the reasons we went down this route was to make sure that we minimize the amount of time and effort involved in actually collecting the data. And that frees up time for the citizens to be involved in other aspects of the knowledge creation process, and analysis of the data, especially with iMHEA. We like to develop local solutions, or to create knowledge that is locally relevant and can be applied locally to improve water management. But it also really allows the citizens and local participants to really be involved in the ideation, the setup and the design of the experiment. And for that purpose, we very much like the conceptual framework developed by Muki Hackley from colleagues here in London from UCL, who came up with this framework or this typology of citizen science projects, depending on the type and the nature of citizens' involvement. And I think what we really like to aim for in the case of iMHEA is at least participatory science, but ideally what Muki calls extreme citizen science, where local collaborators and citizens are involved in that entire process of starting with the ideation, identifying the problem, but then also designing the entire experimental setup in a way that maximizes the value and the usefulness of the data to support local water resources management. And a slightly different way of looking at it is really seeing the purpose of the activities we do as co-creating knowledge that is locally actionable, that is locally useful to support ecosystem management and water resources management. And again, just splitting up the knowledge creation process in those different steps of observation, starting with the data collection, but then also extracting the knowledge from those raw data and interpreting them in a local context is useful to create that knowledge, but at the same time identify further gaps in that knowledge. So it's basically only part of the cycle that then starts over and allows you to then locally identify with local stakeholders where do we need to install more sensors, what kind of variables do we need to measure, what is the purpose, what can we do with these technologies to really collect data that can feed back into local management and governance arrangements. So that's really the philosophy or the analytical or analysis framework that we like to use to constantly query what we do and how we can leverage these technologies to create knowledge that is locally relevant and actionable. I'll speak over that and go to some final challenges or conclusions. Where I see one of the main challenges is in setting up or creating that ecosystem of local technological innovation. One of the great advantages of open hardware is that it really allows you to pass that information and pass that knowledge on to local experts who can manage the sensors, but also potentially improve them. And we've had from local universities queries to pass on the details and the designs of the technology, so they can, with local students, further improve and advance and tailor the designs for their local needs and local contexts. And I think another main challenge is to ensure that that interaction and knowledge exchange continues, and that the raw data really are being interpreted and analyzed in a way that creates locally useful and relevant knowledge. And so a big part of the effort in this setup has gone not so much to the technology development, but building around it all the activities of knowledge exchange and interaction, communication and dissemination that is needed to ensure that we really close that knowledge creation loop, and that we go beyond just the technological setup and development to creating and integrating locally relevant knowledge. And that brings me to the conclusions. So in a way, one can argue that the technology development is the easy part, but around that, it's really essential to create those additional layers of communication, interaction, and locally embedding the technology in local realities to ensure that the activities generate local value and also allow to be sustainable on the long term. And obviously that requires resources, but at the same time, I think the iMHEA example has shown that you can get a really long way with very limited resources. So thank you very much. I think that's all I've got time for, but I'd be more than happy to answer any questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wouter. That's also an impressive experience, and already, I think, also more than 10 years ongoing project in the iMHEA. So let's kick off with some questions. The audience, you can write your questions in the Q&A, and my colleagues maybe cannot write in the Q&A, so they just have to intervene if they have some questions for Ilja, Jan, and Chris. The first question was for Chris, and it was from Rajaram. He will give a presentation, or group will give a presentation, I think, next week. And that is a question I also had, Chris, and that is, what are the major applications of your data set? I mean, you collect a huge data set. What are the main applications?
So the applications are going to change based on who the partner is. So in some cases, so I can give an application from a small town, DeWitt, Michigan, kind of in the center of Michigan. This town is interested in flooding. And so they're interested in having their community understand the relationship between precipitation and flooding in their community. And up until this point, people kind of, it's weird, like as professionals, we think about streams as very dynamic. And sometimes lay people think of streams as just a stream, like it's not changing in stage or anything like that, right? Which sounds crazy to us. So this is one application. Another application is that people have actually used our system in order to create a historical record of stream stage in preparation for industry coming in and potentially taking water out of that stream. And so the application that I can think of here is a bottled water company coming in. And so a stream saying, this stream is important to us, and we want to have a record of what stream stage has been historically, so that when the bottled water company comes in and says, we haven't changed anything, they have a record. And one of the interesting things is they particularly want to partner with universities because we are considered experts and we validate those data, right? And then finally, I think the gold standard, right, is to take stream stage and collect stream flow and get a rating curve so that you actually have discharge, because I think we all realize that stream stage is maybe not as useful as stream discharge. So
Clear. So that also means that you really have a few examples of co-creation, so that it was the local population who came up basically with your with the monitoring request.
Now after maybe 2014, now it's 100% the local population coming up with the monitoring request. And this is kind of one of the problems with citizen science, right? Is you get in because you're kind of interested in it, and then you're locked into it. My commitment is that I run this until 2042. In 2042, I retire and I'm done with it. But everyone who calls me, they say, how long is this going to run, right? And so my commitment is 2042. After 2042, like, they're on their own.
I think it's a great commitment. Thanks a lot, Chris. Okay, Wouter, for you, the question was, how do citizen scientists help in sensor maintenance? Are they trained? How do they repair their sensors in absence, or maybe they are expert themselves? So how do you maintain your network, your sensor network?
Yeah, good question. It's basically the local partners in the network that are responsible for maintaining the sensors. I didn't have the time to elaborate on it, but one of the key aspects we like to foster is this local ownership of the technology, and obviously we support that by providing training and technical expertise. And if they have any questions, they obviously are very welcome to send us an email or a WhatsApp message. But the idea really is, at least on the long term, to create local capacity for the maintenance of the sensors, and even repair them if necessary. One of the big advantages of the open hardware design is that it makes it much easier to create or identify that local capacity for maintenance.
And do you run into big issues then, that maybe hydrologists are not always the best persons to train for the technical aspects of sensor maintenance, and that you maybe also in your university should address or engage completely different background students?
Absolutely. Luckily, not everyone is a hydrologist within the network. But in a way, finding local technical capacity is surprisingly easy, especially through universities. Obviously, you do have electronic and electrical engineering departments and all, but you have even a lot of local young people, students, even secondary school students with a very keen interest in technology, that are often very sharp and capable to learn and manage those systems. Yeah, obviously you do need to bring in that capacity, and that's something we explicitly try to do.
And then who is looking for that capacity? Is it you as a project lead, or is it also the local community who is trying to engage more and more a variety of persons and experts?
It's really the network. So we like to refer to iMHEA as a network of practice, which has a very non-hierarchical structure. And so we prefer not to have someone who really leads, but rather discuss and identify and jointly find solutions. And that works really well. There are several local universities involved who have good contacts with colleagues in other departments, and are often very proactive with coming up with solutions to specific problems. So yeah, ideally it's really a dynamic that keeps itself going.
Thanks, that's great. A question of Solofelo, and Solofelo asks, may you please provide the technical details of the contactless sensor, and can it also be used for groundwater monitoring? So could you share a link, or that's basically the question? I think he refers to mainly the acoustic sensor.
Yeah. So it was visible on the slides. We've got everything on GitHub and have an online manual, which I'll put in the slide in a minute. But the question about groundwater is great, because indeed one of the other advantages of the LiDAR sensor, given it's a very tight laser beam, is that it's potentially useful for groundwater monitoring as well. And we have tried it out in groundwater wells in places like Somalia and the Philippines, and it often does work really well. For very clear water, one disadvantage of LiDAR is that it passes through rather than reflects on very clear water. So in that case, it doesn't work. But even in boreholes, we found that often turbidity is high enough to get sufficient reflection, and that makes it potentially useful in boreholes as well. So yeah, it's quite a flexible technology.
Great. And do you then, how does it compare to using acoustic waves? So they're just sound. You have this mobile phone apps which use sound for groundwater. Would that is that a more robust way compared to your LiDARs?
Well, one is obviously acoustic, the other is an electromagnetic wave light. So that means that the precision tends to be a bit lower, simply because the speed of light is much faster than sound. So timing it requires more expensive technology, or for the same cost, your timer tends to be less accurate. So the ultrasound sensors is the brand Maxbotics, which is very common in citizen science, is about $100 for a sensor and has a resolution of 1 millimeter, while the LiDAR we use is about $150 and has an accuracy of about 1 to 10 centimeters, depending on the distance. It's a relative error. So the error margin is slightly larger. Obviously, you have more precise LiDARs, but then you have to pay. So not always a balance between cost and performance. But I think one of the great advantages of the open hardware is that you can really select the components that give you the right level of performance for the best cost. So the flexibility really allows you to design systems that are more cost effective, simply because you've got more flexibility and you don't have to flesh out for very expensive equipment if you don't really need that level of accuracy. I think that's really the philosophy of going for the most cost-effective option.
Great. Yeah, thanks a lot. Chris, and how do you feel about? I got from your presentation that many of the observations are still manual and done with mobile phones, so they are basically snapshots in time. Are you also thinking of making your whole network sensor based?
So we tried that, and actually we did a very dumb version, right? We also had an acoustic sensor, and it just had it was an Arduino based systems with a cell phone shield on it that actually sent text messages again to our system, and it's pretty cool. Like, it works really well. I don't know. You know, I think at this point we're kind of in a maintenance phase, and I guess the question is what the next phase is after that.
And do you have the feeling because most of your projects are now bottom up, that it is that's the stakeholders, the person who asked you to start the monitoring network, do they prefer the manual ones or the sensor based ones?
The folks that are coming to me, I think, just because of the way that our project is set up, are interested, I think, mostly in the manual side. There are a lot of people that come to us because of educational opportunities, right?
Yeah.
And so you know, our system is a little, you know, our system is a dumb system, right? Like, it's fairly easy to run, and so as a result, people, a lot of the people are from nature preserves and things like that, or that are looking for that kind of engagement with people, and I think you result in less scientifically useful observations, but you have more kind of other opportunities.
Clear. So basically you say for education purposes, the fact that you do the measurement is preferably over than using the data for the education part.
Most of the stations I'm not using for my own research, right? Other than looking at kind of citizen science. Most of the stations, what I'm doing is I'm just a support person in providing the system for people to use. And I can't give a percentage of that, but it's really high, right? As me, as the support scientist, not as the using those data scientist.
Right. Then Wouter, there's one more question, and that is a very technical one, and that is how to get those sensors for your project and what's the price. And I think that you partly answered it, but otherwise you can also maybe provide that information so that we can share it later on as well. But what's the price and how can one get those sensors for their projects? So you might ask.
Great question, and a question we've had a lot, and we've actually started a startup company, River Labs, which was featured on the slides, to enable selling the sensors. But at the moment, we sell the loggers for the cost of the components. The deal is basically we don't provide any guarantee, but obviously there is the whole Arduino ecosystem and software around that's available, simply because we can't afford providing guarantee and all, but it also means that we can keep the cost low. So we sell them on at least for small numbers to anyone who's interested in buying them. I gave the cost of the sensors. The logger that's attached to it is about between $100 and $300, depending on whether it includes telemetry and all. So I think the whole logger with the sensor is somewhere between $300 and $500. And again, that's pretty much the cost of the components and assembly. So we're happy to sell them, and in that case, please just do get in touch with me. Or we're also very happy to share the design templates for anyone who'd be happy or interested in building them themselves.
Yeah, do you? I mean, $300 to $500 is of course not a lot, but it's still significant. So, do you feel that that is still a kind of bottleneck to some of your projects?
Well, that is the design that we thought was the best value for money, if you will. And that is obviously tailored to what we needed in our projects. It is perfectly possible to build cheaper systems, but obviously there will be of lower quality as well. So it's really again finding that balance. And this, unfortunately, that's the state of technology. That is the robustness that we require costs that amount of money. But again, a big advantage of using open hardware toolkits is that you can reduce the price if you're happy with a lower cost, or you're happy to take the risk that failure might be a bit higher. So that's again just entirely determined by the requirements of the context that we have worked.
Very clear. There is a really nice question, and I'll leave that one to Jan. Jan, you posted it. You can also, I think, ask it to both of them.
Yeah. Okay. So both of you mentioned that you have there's a need for a lot of interaction with the public, and a lot of Chris said a lot of shaking hands. Obviously, for us scientists, this is not our main business. So there's limited time, limited resources we can spend in that, and also we can ask our PhD students only to do a somewhat and not all possibilities. So I know there's no perfect answer, but do you have any thoughts on how to be most efficient in this interaction with the public, and how to decide which hands to shake and which maybe not to shake, or to spend less time?
Chris, do you want to go first, or
Sure.
shall I?
You know, Jan, I haven't figured that out yet. You know, that there are sometimes, especially when summer comes, that you're just getting a lot of requests for information. The other thing that in shaking hands doesn't always turn into partnerships, right? And so there's a lot of shaking hands and talking to people, and even sending them equipment that never turns into anything. And so this is something that I really caution early career scientists on, right? In the United States, if you have tenure, you know, you have a little more flexibility in order to kind of shake hands and things not work out. But young scientists, like this is, you're working a lot of nights and weekends in order to kind of keep these things going. And there is almost always in my email box someone asking a question about how to join the network, how to change something, and there's sometimes that I can't answer it that day.
Yeah, I think we come from a different perspective in the sense that for us, community-based science is really a research in itself. So we like doing it because we think that it's great science, almost as experiments in their own rights. But I think more broadly, if you want to do community-based science, then that inevitably involves work, but that's work that not necessarily the scientists need to do. I think what we really want to show is and generate as knowledge is how you implement those projects in the hope that they are replicated and that others will become part of it because they see the value, they see the need to generate that evidence base. But obviously, collecting hydrological data, at least for the foreseeable future, will remain a lot of hard work. The best way to get it done is by sharing that work and involving as many people as possible. That said, I think at the same time, we're trying to make our technology as robust as possible to really minimize the amount of work that goes into it. And we see applications well beyond the kind of community-based science that we do. And indeed, we have sold and provided sensors to groups that were perfectly happy to deal with them themselves and not require any further follow-up from us. And the way we actively like to stimulate that by making sure that there's full documentation, videos, the code and all online, to really hope that people will be able to take the technology forward, improve upon it, tailor it to specific needs, and use it without really us needing to be actively involved.
But it still needs to, like you, Chris and Wouter, both a lot of energy from the two of you. So compliments for that as well. Chris, you had a question. I think, yeah, Chris had a question for Chris.
Yeah, so it kind of builds upon what Wouter was just saying, and directing to Chris is with the staff gauges, the groups that you work with, do you provide guidance to help them understand what's good placement or who they might need to work through to get permissions, if any, or how do they go about doing that?
Yeah, so I have an installation guide that I send out to all community groups, and what I ask for them is that I will cover all the computer side of things, and I will send them templates for all of our signs. It's their responsibility to buy the equipment, which costs about $100 US. It's also their responsibility to get permissions to put it into their local waterway. And there are some states in the United States that have rules that say that you can't install things in a waterway because they're considered snags for boat traffic and things like that. And so it's the responsibility of my partner organization, so the community scientists, in order to get that permission.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Then one last question we have, and that is like, what do you, both you, Wouter and Chris, you basically generate a hell of a lot of data, but there is always some steps between that raw data and making it useful for anything, for any question, for a model, for example. How much time and energy do you spend on making those data useful for the stakeholders? Chris first.
I don't post-process any of the data. Okay. I have bounds on what is an acceptable measurement to come in, but what you'll see is there are ugly babies, right? Yeah. And you saw that in my hydrograph. You saw water levels that were way off. And I talked to people about uncertainty and about the uncertainty in these kinds of measurements. We do have a paper on some decision tree analysis to pick out bad data. But at this point, if someone sends in a measurement that was in the bounds, we accept that measurement as a valid measurement.
Okay. Yeah. And Wouter?
Well, we spend a lot of time analyzing the data simply because we think it's great science. I mean, the data from iMHEA have been used in studies that have been published in places like Nature Sustainability. So we see it as part of our research. That said, there's only obviously so much you can do. And again, we try and support as much as we can others that like to do the analysis, including the development of tools we just launched an R toolbox for the post-processing of rainfall and discharge data of the type that's come off the iMHEA sites, with the idea that others will pick it up and help with the analysis. And the data themselves are also in the public domain, and I think that's pretty much all we can do. But so as much as we can, but obviously there are limits to our time. There are only 24 hours in a day, but well,
that's true. And there's only 60 minutes in 1 hour webinar, and we are almost at the end of that one. So thank you very much, Chris and Wouter. Really excellent talks, and really appreciate your time in this. I also want to thank Ilja, Chris, Jan, and of course, Julia from CUAHSI for helping organizing it for today. We still have 2 more, and I will share my screen if I do that quickly. Oh, yeah, we still have 2 more weeks coming up. Next week, we have the lessons learned, sustaining participations in citizen science, and then also, and we already had a few of those discussions today here, using citizen science data in our models, and see how we can do that. Having said that, thank you all for participating. We will share all the links and QR codes in the material linked to this CUAHSI webinar. You will see it on the website. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon, I think, for many in the United States, and good night, Asia. And I think for us in Europe, it's having a great dinner. Thank you all.